In Strange World, the most dangerous territory is not the uncharted land beneath Avalonia. It is the distance between 3 generations of one family. That is our first clue. Because on the surface, this is a Disney adventure built from strange creatures, impossible landscapes, flying machines, and the promise of discovering something no one has ever seen before. But the deeper you look, the more the movie keeps turning our attention away from the exotic world and back towards something much more familiar. Parents trying to decide what their children should become, children trying to escape the weight of those expectations, and the family discovering that love can still become pressure when nobody is truly listening. Welcome to the Film Box. This is the place where we do not just ask what happened in the movie. We ask why certain choices were made, why a scene feels the way it does, why one image keeps returning, and what the film is quietly telling you underneath all this spectacle. Every film is a box. We open it together, and Strange World gives us a very unusual box. At first glance, the movie appears to be reaching backward into the pulpy adventure stories of another era. You can feel the DNA of old exploration tales in the heroic poses, the impossible geography, the dangerous unknown, and the idea that somewhere beyond the map there must be something extraordinary waiting to be found. Yet the film keeps challenging the very fantasy it seems to celebrate. What happens when exploration is no longer just about conquering the unknown? What happens when the person you are supposed to become is not the person you actually want to be? That tension sits inside the Clade family from the beginning. Disney's official description frames Strange World around 3 generations of the legendary Clades as they are forced to work together while navigating an unpredictable world beneath their own. And that detail matters because the movie's real terrain is not only physical. Each generation is carrying a different idea of success. One sees greatness as adventure, another sees greatness as stability, and the next is still trying to decide what greatness should mean at all. Put those 3 ideas in the same family, then throw that family into a place where none of the usual assumptions work, and suddenly the strange creatures are not the only source of tension. That is where this movie becomes more interesting than its reputation might suggest. Strange World was not a film that dominated the cultural conversation in the way some Disney animation releases have. For many people, it arrived, passed through theaters, appeared on streaming, and became one of those titles they vaguely knew existed without feeling an urgent need to open. But that makes this breakdown more interesting, not less. Because films that miss the center of the spotlight can sometimes reveal their strengths and weaknesses more clearly once the noise around release has faded. And I am coming into this one with a mixed but genuinely curious perspective. My personal rating is 6.3 out of 10. That score means there are things here I really admire. The visual imagination is bold. The family dynamic has real ideas inside it. The movie is willing to build an adventure around generational conflict rather than a simple hero versus villain structure. But there are also moments where the emotional machinery feels smoother in theory than it does in practice. Some ideas land, others feel like they needed another layer of pressure, another complication, or simply more time to breathe. So we are not going to treat Strange World as a hidden masterpiece that everyone misunderstood, and we are not going to dismiss it as a failed Disney experiment either. We are going to open it carefully. We will follow the family conflict, the visual design, the filmmaking choices, the world building, the humor, the themes, the criticism, and eventually the full spoiler machinery of the ending. And as we move deeper, keep one question in the back of your mind. Is the strange world really the place these characters discover? Or is it a version of their own family they have never been willing to see clearly? Because before we can answer that, we need to understand the one contradiction the movie puts in front of us almost immediately. It gives us a family famous for exploration. Then it asks whether following someone else's path can actually stop you from discovering who you are. And that is where our first real compartment opens. The most interesting thing about Strange World is that it keeps presenting discovery as something heroic, then quietly asks whether discovery means anything if you cannot recognize the person standing beside you. That contradiction is the movie's real hook. This is a story filled with maps, expeditions, unexplored territory, inherited legends, and the thrill of pushing past the edge of what is known. Everything about the setup tells you that greatness belongs to the person willing to go farther than everyone else. But the film immediately complicates that idea. Because what if going farther is not the same thing as understanding more? What if being brave enough to enter an unknown world is easier than being brave enough to admit that your child wants a different life from the one you imagined for them? That is the tension buried underneath the adventure. The Clade family does not simply disagree, they inherit expectations from one another. One generation builds an identity around exploration. The next pushes against that identity and finds purpose somewhere else. Then another generation grows up beneath a completely different set of expectations, only to discover that even a parent who believes they are giving freedom can still quietly begin designing a future for their child. That is where Strange World becomes sharper than its colorful surface suggests. The film is not asking whether parents love their children. They clearly do. It is asking whether love alone is enough if that love comes attached to a plan. And that is a much more uncomfortable question because sometimes pressure does not sound like pressure. Sometimes it sounds like encouragement. Sometimes control does not look cruel, it looks supportive. Sometimes a parent genuinely believes they are protecting a child from the mistakes of the past while accidentally creating a new version of the same problem. That pattern is the mechanism we need to watch. The details change from generation to generation, but the instinct remains familiar. I know what kind of life will make you happy because I have already learned what matters. That sentence can come from love. It can also close a door. And Strange World places that emotional mechanism inside an adventure story where opening doors is supposed to be the entire point. That is why the setting matters so much. The world around these characters becomes increasingly unfamiliar. Normal rules stop applying. The environment refuses to behave the way they expect. Every new discovery forces them to reconsider what they thought they understood. Yet the hardest assumptions to abandon are not scientific, they are personal. Each member of this family carries a map of who they are, a map of who they are supposed to be, a map of what a successful life looks like. And if those maps are wrong, then the greatest challenge in the movie is not navigating strange terrain. It is accepting that the destination you chose for someone else may never have belonged to them. That is the idea that makes this film worth opening. Not because Strange World executes every part of that idea perfectly, it does not. There are moments where the storytelling moves so quickly that an emotional conflict arrives before it has fully accumulated enough weight. There are character beats that feel designed to make a thematic point before they feel completely lived in. And sometimes the film explains its emotional architecture when trusting the characters a little more might have made the same ideas hit harder. But the central mechanism is strong. Three generations, three definitions of purpose, three people trying, in different ways, to avoid becoming the person who disappointed them. That last part is especially important because people rarely repeat family patterns by making exactly the same choices. More often, they repeat them while trying desperately to do the opposite. A person can reject someone else's path and still inherit the emotional habit that created it. That is where the earlier clue changes shape. The Clades are explorers, but exploration is not only their profession or their legend, it is the test the film quietly gives them. Can they explore a possibility that threatens their own identity? Can they accept that someone they love may choose a path they do not understand? Can they enter an emotional territory where they are no longer the expert? Those questions carry more danger than any creature waiting beyond the map. And as the movie begins opening that idea, the adventure becomes less about finding something completely new and more about noticing a pattern that has been sitting inside this family for years. To understand how deliberately the film builds that contradiction, we have to move outside the story for a moment. Because the next compartment is behind the camera. And once you look at how Strange World was conceived, designed, and positioned, several choices inside the finished film start making a lot more sense. Before the cage ever entered that enormous underground landscape, Strange World began with a much smaller question. Director Don Hall has explained that one of the earliest ideas behind the film came from thinking about his own children and the kind of world their generation would inherit. He wanted to explore what it means to become a good ancestor, and he chose to express that idea through three generations of one family. Co-director and writer Queen described the story in similarly connected terms, an adventure involving parents and children, complicated family relationships, and humanity's place inside a larger environment. That changes the way you look at the clades immediately. The three generation structure is not simply there because three different personalities create comedy. It is the experiment. Jagger, Searcher, and Ethan allow the movie to place the past, present, and future in the same room. One generation leaves consequences for another. That generation tries to correct what came before. Then the youngest generation inherits both the solution and the new problems created by it. Suddenly, the family argument we have been following becomes connected to the environmental idea hiding underneath the adventure. What do you leave behind? And does believing that you are helping the next generation guarantee that you actually are? The second production clue looks backward rather than forward. Hall and Nguyen drew inspiration from early 20th century adventure fiction, including the tradition associated with Jules Verne, Arthur Conan Doyle, pulp serials, and films such as King Kong. The filmmakers also look beyond those stories for the film's visual language. Hall discussed early American landscape paintings as references for vistas and lighting, French Belgian comics for aspects of character styling, and even the Iowa farm where he grew up as an influence on Avalonia's agricultural landscape. And that mixture explains one of the movie's most interesting visual contradictions. Strange World looks nostalgic without actually being located in our past. The explorers have the exaggerated confidence of old adventure heroes. Machines feel chunky and tactile. Buildings and equipment often appear built to be touched rather than simply displayed. Even the Clades themselves can feel like characters who have walked out of an illustrated adventure magazine. But the ideas inside that package are much more contemporary. That contrast is important. The film borrows the visual excitement of stories about conquering mysterious territory, then begins questioning the mentality that often comes with conquest. Jaeger fits comfortably inside the older adventure image. Go farther, plant the flag, become the legend. But Strange World keeps asking whether the world exists to be conquered in the first place. So, the retro influence is not just decoration, it gives the movie a heroic language that the story can gradually challenge. Then we get to the design of the Strange World itself. Production designer Merdad Iswandi and the environmental team deliberately avoided making the underground environment behave like a normal landscape. Iswandi explained that familiar categories were meant to become unreliable there. Something resembling a tree might not function like a tree, and the jungle like environment was designed without green. The production also treated parts of the environment almost like living characters rather than passive scenery. That decision does something clever to your instincts. We are trained by years of visual storytelling to understand environments quickly. Green usually suggests plant life. A rock behaves like a rock. A tree stays where a tree is supposed to stay. Background objects remain in the background. But this world keeps refusing those assumptions. You cannot simply look at something and know its purpose. And that is exactly what the characters are doing incorrectly with one another. Setcher thinks he understands Jaeger. Jaeger thinks he understands what his family should value. Sutter believes he understands Ethan's future. Everybody is labeling what they see before they truly understand how it functions. The production design turns that emotional mistake into geography. That toys opens another compartment because creating an environment that behaves like a living system presented an unusually large technical problem for the animation team. Disney's own production coverage described these as some of the largest environments the studio had built at that point. Head of Environments John Jenkins said the first versions were too large to display as a complete world on the available computers, requiring the team to work out how to preserve detail from tiny environmental elements to enormous structures. The production also created an animated environment supervisor role for Ben Fisk, specifically to help manage a landscape whose movement was fundamental to its design. That technical challenge matters because the underground world cannot feel like a painted backdrop. It has to feel active. Watch how often the environment appears to breathe, swarm, react, travel, gather, or reorganize itself. Even when the Clades believe they are crossing empty terrain, the movie creates the impression that they are moving through something with behavior. That sensation becomes essential to the mystery. If the environment were visually static, the characters would remain the obvious center of every frame. Instead, the world constantly competes with them. Something shifts behind them. Something they assumed was scenery behaves differently. Scale becomes difficult to judge. The explorers might believe they are investigating the world, but visually the world seems almost capable of investigating them back. And without discussing where that idea eventually leads, it is worth remembering. The strange world is designed to make certainty difficult. There is one more production detail that connects directly to the family performances. Producer Roy Conley described the film as an iterative collaboration involving hundreds of artists, while members of the cast discussed contributing their own instincts to their characters. Jake Gyllenhaal said that his ideas became part of his developing interpretation of Searcher, and he described animators observing performers' expressions and physical behavior as the character evolved. Gabrielle Union similarly discussed improvisational contributions that were retained in the finished performance. That helps explain why the family scenes often work best when they become slightly messy. Not the big declarations, the interruptions, the awkward enthusiasm, the physical reactions when somebody realizes they have said too much. Such are trying so hard to communicate that the effort itself becomes uncomfortable. Jaeger occupying emotional space with the same confidence he uses to occupy physical space. Meridian cutting through the chaos with a different energy. Ethan reacting like someone who knows the adults around him are repeating patterns they cannot yet see. Those small behaviors prevent the movie from becoming nothing but a diagram about generational trauma and environmental responsibility. At its strongest, there are people inside the diagram, and now the mechanism behind the film becomes clearer. A story born from questions about inheritance, a visual style borrowed partly from old exploration adventures, a world deliberately designed to defeat familiar assumptions, an environment complicated enough that it had to behave almost like another character, and performances shaped through an unusually collaborative animation process. Put those pieces together and Strange World stops looking like a random collection of colorful Disney ideas. There is a design connecting them. The characters enter believing they understand what exploration means. The movie builds an entire world whose purpose is to prove how little they actually understand. And with the machinery behind the film established, we can finally open the box itself and ask a more basic question. What exactly is Strange World trying to be? So what exactly is Strange World trying to be? Released in 2022, Strange World is a Walt Disney Animation Studios science fiction adventure directed by Don Hall, with Kineen serving as co-director and writer. Its central voice cast includes Jake Gyllenhaal as Searcher Clade, Dennis Quaid as Jaeger Clade, Jabuki Young White as Ethan Clade, Gabrielle Union as Meridian Clade, and Lucy Liu as Callisto Mal. On paper, that sounds like the setup for a classic expedition movie. A legendary explorer, his very different son, a younger generation caught between inherited expectations, an unexplored environment, a mission where failure could threaten everything the characters know. But calling Strange World simply an adventure movie misses what the film is actually trying to build. At its heart, this is a family story disguised as an expedition. The fantasy landscape provides movement, danger, mystery, and visual spectacle, but the emotional engine is the Clade family itself. The movie places three generations beside one another and gives each of them a different relationship with ambition. Jaeger believes identity comes from pursuing something enormous. Searcher has deliberately built his life around rejecting that definition. Ethan is growing up inside the life Searcher created and beginning to wonder whether he wants something different again. That pattern is our clue trail. Nobody is merely rebelling. Each generation believes it has learned from the previous one, and yet the same basic mistake keeps returning in a new form. That is why the movie exists as more than a colorful underground adventure. Its environmental ideas and its family ideas are constructed around the same principle: inheritance. What do we receive from the people before us? What do we preserve? What do we change? And how do we know whether the thing that benefits us today is quietly creating a problem for someone tomorrow? The adventure tradition that inspired the film gives those questions a useful disguise. Old exploration stories often celebrate the person brave enough to move beyond the known world. Strange World borrows that excitement, but it shifts the definition of bravery. Going somewhere unknown is one kind of courage. Allowing your understanding of the world to collapse is another. And allowing your understanding of your own family to collapse may be harder still. That is why my spoiler free verdict lands somewhere in the middle. There's a lot to appreciate here. The world itself is visually imaginative. The central generational idea has genuine emotional potential. The film avoids building everything around a conventional villain, which gives the conflict a different texture. And at its best, Strange World finds a meaningful connection between family expectations and humanity's relationship with the environment around it. But the movie also struggles to give every one of those ideas enough dramatic weight. Sometimes the themes are more interesting than the scenes carrying them. Sometimes a conflict that should feel complicated becomes surprisingly easy to understand because the characters state their emotional position so clearly. And because the movie is trying to juggle adventure, comedy, family drama, ecological ideas, generational conflict, and a mystery at the same time, certain relationships do not get quite enough space to become as powerful as they could have been. That does not make the film empty, it makes it uneven. And that distinction matters. If you come to Strange World expecting the emotional precision of Disney's strongest family stories, you may feel that several moments stop just short of their full potential. If you approach it as a visually ambitious adventure with an unusually sincere idea about parents, children, and inherited expectations, there is considerably more to unpack. It is especially worth watching if you enjoy animated films that build worlds with their own physical logic rather than simply placing familiar characters inside a fantasy backdrop. It may also connect with you if you have ever experienced that strange moment when someone who loves you starts describing your future and you realize the future they are describing belongs more to them than to you. That is the human pressure point underneath everything, and it is why the clades matter more than the creatures. The strange landscape can surprise them. It can frighten them. It can force them to change direction, but the world cannot decide who they should become. They do that to one another, which means that before this expedition can reveal anything important about the place beneath Avalonia, the film has to establish what these characters feel like before their assumptions begin breaking apart. And that starts with the opening. Because Strange World tells you almost immediately what kind of adventure you think you're about to watch, then it begins quietly replacing that movie with another one. The opening of Strange World does something deceptively simple. It makes you think you already understand the kind of movie you are watching. The exaggerated adventure imagery, the heroic reputation surrounding Jaeger Clade, the obsession with unexplored territory, and the almost storybook quality of the family legend all establish a familiar rhythm. Jaeger feels like the kind of character an old expedition serial would build an entire mythology around. He is enormous in personality as much as appearance. Everything points forward beyond the mountains, beyond the map, beyond whatever anyone else has already accomplished. And then Surtur changes the direction of the story. That is what hooked me about the opening. Not simply the adventure, the interruption of the adventure. The movie establishes one definition of heroism so confidently that when Surtur begins looking at the world differently, the contrast becomes immediately visible. His father is searching for a path through the unknown. Searcher notices something closer to the ground. That difference tells us almost everything we need to know about them. Jacker looks toward the horizon. Searcher looks at what is directly in front of him. Neither instinct is automatically wrong. That is what makes the conflict useful. The atmosphere at first has this playful, retro confidence. It feels like the movie is inviting us into a grand exploration tale where danger will be exciting, discovery will be glorious, and the biggest personality in the room will naturally lead everyone toward the answer. But underneath that excitement, there is discomfort. Searcher does not fit the story Jaeger believes they are living, and you can feel that mismatch almost immediately. The father sees continuation, the son sees another possibility. That tension gives the opening more emotional weight than the surface level adventure would have on its own. Then the film makes a major shift. Instead of staying permanently inside Jaeger's legendary expedition mentality, it shows us the life Setcher builds after refusing that path. The tone changes with him. The world becomes warmer, more domestic, more settled. The energy of endless exploration gives way to agriculture, community, routine, and family. That transition is crucial because it visually tells us that Searcher believes he escaped the problem. He did not become his father. He chose stability instead of endless adventure. He built a home. He became present. He values a life that Jacob might once have considered too small. And for a while, the film encourages you to see that as progress. This is where my first watch reaction becomes more complicated. Because Searcher is easy to understand, he is enthusiastic, affectionate, and clearly determined to create a different relationship with Ethan than the relationship he had with Jaeger. There is something genuinely likable about that intention, but the movie starts planting another clue almost immediately. Searcher talks about Ethan's future with a little too much certainty. Not aggressively, not cruelly. That would be easier to recognize. Instead, it comes wrapped in excitement. He loves the life he created, so naturally, he imagines Ethan loving it too. And that is when the family pattern quietly returns. This is what made the opening interesting enough for me to keep leaning in even when some of the comedy did not land equally well. The film is showing us repetition without duplication. Seja is not becoming Jaeger. By acting like Jaeger, he is becoming similar to him through expectation. Jaeger imagined the future as exploration and assumed his son would share it. Secher imagines the future differently and begins making the same assumption about Ethan. Different destination. Same emotional map. That is much more interesting than simply having one strict parent and one rebellious child. The movie gives Searcher enough warmth that you can understand how someone repeats a family pattern while sincerely believing they have broken it. And then Ethan enters the equation with a different energy entirely. He does not carry Jaeger's booming certainty. He does not share Searcher's enthusiasm for the future being prepared for him. His uncertainty feels important. He is still figuring himself out. That means the opening is not merely setting up three characters, it is establishing three relationships with identity. Jaeger treats identity like a mission. Sutter treats identity like a choice he has already made successfully. Ethan treats identity like something still being discovered. That last approach may actually be the most exploratory of all. The visual world around them supports this feeling. Avalonia has enough fantasy in its design to feel separate from our reality, but it is not presented as cold science fiction. It has texture. Farms, machinery, community spaces, unusual technology, and rounded architecture make it feel lived in rather than merely futuristic. That warmth matters because the film needs us to understand why Searcher wants to protect this life. If Avalonia felt empty, his attachment to stability would mean very little. Instead, this world feels comfortable, and comfort becomes part of the conflict. Jaeger was obsessed with what existed beyond the familiar. Setter built something valuable inside the familiar. Ethan is the person who may have to decide whether either option completely fits him. The opening therefore creates a strange emotional expectation. The premise promises discovery, but the first 10 minutes make the family more interesting than the destination. That is both a strength and a warning sign for the movie. It is a strength because the adventure already has an emotional mechanism underneath it. It is a warning because once the story moves into bigger spectacle, the film will need to keep those relationships alive, rather than allowing the creatures and environments to do all the work. For me, that uncertainty is what made it difficult to look away. I wanted to know whether the movie understood the pattern it was creating. Would Sacher recognize that rejecting his father's dream did not automatically free him from his father's habits? Would Ethan be allowed to choose something neither older generation could predict? And would Jaeger remain simply the symbol of an outdated idea? Or would the film allow him to become more complicated than that? Those questions were stronger than the basic mission. And once the adventure finally begins pushing this family out of the comfortable world they think they understand, the visual language changes with it. Because the next compartment is not about what the characters say, it is about what the camera, color, movement, design, and editing are already telling us before anyone explains a thing. The filmmaking of Strange World works best when the movie stops trying to impress you with how much is on screen and starts using design to make the familiar feel unreliable. That distinction matters. This is not a film chasing photorealism. Its characters are broad, rounded, exaggerated, and instantly readable. Its machines have weight without looking mechanically realistic. Its landscapes often feel closer to illustrated adventure art than ordinary geography. That approach fits Gyllenhaal's stated inspiration from early pulp adventure magazines, where explorers journey into impossible places and encounter worlds beyond anything they understand. But Strange World does not simply imitate that old visual language, it bends it. Look at the difference between Avalonia and the world beneath it. Avalonia is designed around recognition. Roads lead somewhere, farms create visible patterns, buildings have understandable purposes. Machines may look fantastical, but their functions remain clear. The compositions usually allow your eye to settle quickly because this is Searcher's world of stability. He has built a life based on knowing what things are for. Then the film removes that certainty. Once the expedition moves into the strange world, color becomes one of the most important storytelling tools. The filmmakers deliberately designed this jungle-like environment without dream. Production designer Medhat Isfandi explained that familiar visual categories were intentionally disrupted. Something resembling a tree might not actually function like a tree, and the absence of ordinary jungle colors was meant to prevent the audience's brain from instantly knowing how to interpret what it sees. That is an excellent choice because color is doing thematic work. Green would give us a shortcut. We would see green vegetation and immediately think nature. Instead, the environment arrives in reds, pinks, oranges, purples, and other unexpected tones. It looks organic without using the visual language we normally associate with organic life. So your eye has to investigate. You cannot simply categorize. You have to look again. And that is exactly the emotional skill the Clades lack. They keep looking at one another and assuming they already understand what they see. The production design therefore turns the film's central family problem into a visual principle. Do not trust the first label. The same idea appears in shape language. Many parts of the strange world are soft, rounded, elastic, or flowing rather than rigid and architectural. The landscape seems capable of reacting rather than merely existing. Disney's production team treated this environment unusually because so much of it had to move. The studio even created a dedicated animated environment supervisor role as the filmmakers developed a setting whose background elements behaved more like active organisms. That changes the relationship between foreground and background. In many animated adventure films, characters move while the landscape gives them a stage. Here, the landscape often seems to participate. Objects pulse, surfaces shift, groups of creatures reorganize themselves. Large forms make tiny characters look temporarily insignificant. The film keeps reminding us that the Clades are entering a system much larger than themselves, and the camera language responds to that scale. When the movie wants adventure, it opens the composition. Characters become small against enormous spaces. Movement travels across the frame. The visual emphasis shifts toward depth, distance, and the promise that something unexpected could appear anywhere. But family conflict frequently brings the framing closer. Bodies become more important than landscapes. Expressions carry the tension. Characters occupy the same physical area while emotionally pulling in different directions. That contrast is simple but effective. The world becomes enormous when they are exploring it. The frame becomes tighter when they are trapped inside their assumptions. Even character animation contributes to that separation. Jaeger moves like somebody who expects space to accommodate him. His poses are large, his confidence is visible before he says anything. Searcher's energy is different. He can be expressive and enthusiastic, but there is more nervous effort in him, especially when he is trying to create connection rather than command attention. Ethan is looser, less fixed. His physicality fits a character whose identity has not yet hardened into one definition. Those differences keep three generations visually distinct without requiring the script to explain every contrast. Then there is Splat. A character like Splat could easily become nothing more than a cute merchandising design. But visually, Splat has an important function. There is almost nothing familiar to hold on to. No human face, no conventional body structure, no obvious verbal language. The design forces communication to happen through movement, rhythm, reaction, and shape. Disney Animation later highlighted Splat's unusually demanding artistic requirements, including specialized shader work developed for the character. But the more important result is emotional rather than technical. Splat becomes a test of interpretation. Can a character understand something without forcing it into a familiar category? That question runs through the entire film. Editing supports the same idea by keeping the adventure relatively energetic without turning every sequence into visual chaos. The movie frequently moves from wide discovery shots into reaction driven character beats. Spectacle establishes the new information. A character response tells us what that discovery means emotionally. Then the film pushes forward. When that rhythm works, Strange World feels lively. When it becomes too fast, however, the same technique works against the drama. Emotional moments can sometimes feel like they have been given enough screen time to communicate the necessary information, but not enough silence to deepen it. That is one reason the movie's visual storytelling can occasionally feel stronger than its emotional storytelling. The artist built layers into the world. The environment can suggest uncertainty before anyone speaks. Color can tell you that normal categories have failed. Scale can tell you that the characters misunderstand their importance. Movement can make the landscape feel interconnected. But when the dialogue explains the emotional meaning immediately afterward, the movie occasionally closes a compartment that the visuals had already opened more elegantly. Still, the technical idea holding everything together is strong. Strange World uses visual unfamiliarity as more than decoration. The filmmakers designed a place where recognition becomes unreliable. You see something, you make an assumption. Then the film changes its function, and that prepares us perfectly for the next stage of the story. Because now that we understand how the movie teaches us not to trust appearances, we can follow the central causal path and see exactly what happens when the Clade family keeps trusting its assumptions anyway. The story of Strange World really begins with a disagreement about what discovery is supposed to look like. Years before the main expedition, Jaeger Clade leads a mission across the mountains surrounding Avalonia. For him, the purpose is simple: reach the unexplored territory beyond them and secure the kind of achievement that turns a person into a legend. Searcher, still young and traveling with his father, notices something Jaeger considers far less important: a strange energy producing plant, later called Pando. That moment divides the family. Jaeger sees the mountain as the unfinished mission. Searcher sees Pando as the discovery that actually matters, and both believe the other is abandoning the important path. Searcher returns to Avalonia while Jaeger continues alone. This is our first major causal connection because Searcher does not simply reject his father. He builds an entire identity around proving that Jaeger's idea of greatness was wrong. Pando transforms Avalonia. Searcher grows from the explorer's son into a celebrated farmer. Instead of risking his life chasing the horizon, he cultivates something useful. Pando becomes the foundation of Avalonia's energy system, powering technology and changing daily life. Satser S apparently won the argument. Jaeger wanted one spectacular discovery. Satcher creates a discovery that benefits everyone. But notice what happens psychologically. Searcher does not stop defining himself in relation to his father. He becomes the opposite of Jaeger, and being someone's opposite can still mean allowing that person to determine the shape of your life. That choice becomes more important when we meet Ethan. Searcher loves his son. There is no doubt about that. He wants to work beside him, teach in the farm, and eventually watch Ethan continue what he built. To Searcher, this feels completely different from what Jaeger did. Yaga pushed exploration onto him. Searcher believes he is offering Ethan security, responsibility, and a meaningful place inside something already successful. But Ethan is not particularly interested in becoming the next Pando farmer. He is drawn toward his own relationships, his own curiosity, and possibilities that do not fit neatly inside Setcher's plan. There is no explosion yet, just friction, and that is exactly how generational patterns usually survive. They rarely return wearing the same clothes. Sechel has changed the dream but preserved the expectation. Then the physical crisis begins. Pando starts failing. The plant that powers Avalonia is becoming infected at its roots, threatening not just Secher's farm but the energy system built around it. Kalistomal arrives with a mission: travel underground, find whatever is harming Pando, and stop it before the damage spreads. Searcher does not initially want another grand expedition. He has spent years becoming the man who stayed home. But Pando is not just a crop to him, it represents his life's work. It represents the choice that separated him from Jaeger. If Pando fails, then something much larger than a power source is threatened. The evidence that Searcher was right is threatened too. So he joins the mission. Ethan, meanwhile, becomes involved despite Searcher's desire to keep him away from the danger, and Maritian follows when she realizes what has happened. Now the movie has done something important. It places Searcher in Jaker's old position. He has something he believes must be protected. He has a son whose desires do not align perfectly with his own, and he is entering unknown territory convinced that he understands the mission. That last assumption will not survive. The expedition descends beneath Avalonia and enters the strange world we have been preparing for, visually a place where almost everything behaves differently from how it appears. The mission initially seems straightforward: follow the roots of Pando, locate the infection, destroy whatever is attacking the plant, restore Avalonia. That is the practical objective. But the theme keeps introducing evidence that makes this interpretation less secure. The strange environment is active rather than passive. Creatures move in organized patterns. What initially looks threatening does not always behave like a predator. The landscape seems less like a random ecosystem and more like a coordinated system with functions nobody on the expedition understands. Then Searcher encounters the one person who immediately drags the emotional past into the present: Jaeger. After decades apart, father and son are suddenly together again, and their reunion does not erase the years between them. Jaeger is still fixated on exploration. Searcher is still carrying the wound of having been left behind. Jaeger views his continued mission as dedication. Searcher experienced it as abandonment. That difference matters because two people can remember the same decision and live with completely different emotional meanings. The film now places three Clade generations side by side. Jaeger looks at Ethan and sees possibility. Ethan is fascinated by Jaeger because Jaeger represents a world outside the future Searcher has imagined for him. Searcher watches that connection and becomes uncomfortable. And there is the mechanism again. Seacher spent years angry that Jaeger wanted him to become an explorer. Now he is disturbed by the possibility that Ethan might actually enjoy exploration. The irony is not subtle, but it is effective. Seacher does not want Ethan to become Jaeger because Seacher's conflict with Jaeger has become part of his definition of what a good life should be. So even his attempt to protect Ethan contains an inherited wound. Ethan, meanwhile, has a different way of reading the strange world. His worldview is partly expressed through the strategy game he enjoys, where success is not necessarily about defeating everything on the board. Cooperation and coexistence can matter more than domination. Sutter initially struggles with that logic, and this is where a seemingly small character detail becomes structurally important. The expedition itself is behaving according to the wrong game. They assume something is attacking Pando. Therefore, they need to defeat the attacker. Threat appears. Response follows. Enemy identified. Enemy eliminated. That is the old adventure logic, but the environment keeps resisting that interpretation. Splat becomes one of Ethan's clearest pieces of evidence. At first, this strange blue creature is impossible to classify, yet Ethan forms a connection with it rather than treating it solely as a threat. That relationship matters because Ethan is doing emotionally what the others repeatedly fail to do. He allows something unfamiliar to remain unfamiliar long enough to learn from it. He does not need to dominate it first. The adults are still trying to force the environment into categories they already understand. Useful, dangerous, obstacle, resource, enemy. Ethan starts asking a better question. What if we have misunderstood the system? As the expedition moves deeper, the family conflict becomes harder to separate from the environmental mystery. Searcher and Jaeger continue fighting over the past. Jaeger feels that Searcher abandoned the expedition. Searcher believes Jaeger abandoned him. Neither man has fully accepted that the other person was allowed to want a different life. That is the emotional sentence connecting every stage of the film. You are allowed to choose, but you are not allowed to choose differently from me. And Sacher is now repeating a version of that with Ethan. Eventually, Ethan makes his position clearer. He does not want to inherit the farm simply because Sacher expects him to. For Sacher, that lands painfully. The farm is not merely work, it is proof that his choice mattered. It is the life he created after refusing Jaeger. So when Ethan rejects that future, Sacher experiences it as something more personal than he should. This is exactly where the film's generational idea becomes strongest. Parents often hand children things they struggle to build and assume the child will understand the sacrifice through gratitude. But the child experiences the finished result, not the struggle that created it. Seattle sees the farm as freedom from Jaeger. Ethan may experience the same farm as another predetermined path, same place, different meaning. Then the ecological mystery reaches its turning point. The group discovers that what they have been calling an infection is not behaving like an invading disease in the simple sense they assumed. The strange creatures are actively working against Pando. That appears to confirm the expedition's original belief. Pando is under attack. Save Pando, save Avalonia. But Ethan begins connecting the clues differently. The coordinated creatures, the unusual terrain, the repeated sense that the landscape behaves like biological tissue rather than ordinary geography, the structures they have been moving through, the scale of everything around them, the clues start pointing toward a possibility that radically changes the mission. This place may not simply be a world beneath their world, and Pando may not be the innocent organism everyone believes it is. That realization forces the story to confront the deepest version of its central theme. Searcher's greatest achievement may also be causing damage. Not because he wanted to hurt anyone, not because Pando was introduced with evil intentions, but because usefulness in the short term does not guarantee harmlessness in the long term. That is exactly the environmental version of the family conflict. Jayaved believed his dream was good for Sersher. Sersher believed the farm would be good for Ethan. Avalonia believes Pando is good because it gave society prosperity. In every case, something beneficial from one perspective becomes destructive when nobody questions the larger system around it. That is the connection the entire movie has been building toward. The story is not really asking whether these people are good or bad. It is asking whether they can change when evidence threatens something they built their identity around. Jagger must accept that reaching the destination is not the only measure of a meaningful life. Seater must accept that Pando, the symbol of everything he achieved, may need to be surrendered. And he must accept something even more personal. Ethan's future does not belong to him. The adventure has finally changed its definition of heroism. The heroic act is no longer conquering unknown. It is admitting that your map was wrong. Sacher has spent most of his life believing that Jaeger's mistake was choosing exploration, but the deeper truth is that Jaeger's mistake was refusing to let Sacher define his own purpose. And Sacher can only truly break that pattern when he gives Ethan the freedom he once demanded for himself. Now the family problem and the ecological problem are no longer separate. They are the same mechanism at different scales. Something is inherited. It becomes normal. Its benefits make questioning it difficult. Then a younger perspective reveals a cost the older generation could not or would not see. The only way forward is not to preserve the old system at any price. It is to listen, adapt, and accept that survival may require letting go of the thing you once believed proved you were right. The Clades entered the strange world believing they had come to save Pando. But the closer they get to the truth, the more obvious it becomes that their real task is learning what Pando actually means inside a system far larger than themselves. And once that truth becomes impossible to ignore, the mission, the family legacy, and the future of Avalonia all have to be reconsidered at the same time. And this is the moment the box opens completely. Once the box is fully open, the strongest thing about Strange World becomes easier to see. This movie is at its best when the adventure, the family conflict, and the environmental idea all become different expressions of the same problem. That kind of structural connection is difficult to build. A weaker version of this story could have treated the underground mission as one plot and the Clade family drama as another. The characters would argue during the adventure, resolve their personal issues, defeat some external threat, and go home. Strange World tries something more ambitious. The external problem is connected directly to the emotional problem. Everyone keeps assuming they understand what should be protected. Jaeger protects his dream. Searcher protects Pando and the future he imagined for Ethan. Avalonia protects the system that made its comfortable life possible. And in each case, the film eventually asks the same question: what happens when protecting something familiar begins causing harm? That is the movie's strongest piece of story construction. The antagonist is not really one evil character, it is certainty. That choice allows the conflict to remain personal without reducing the story to a conventional villain who simply needs to be defeated. And when the film trusts that structure, it works. The performances help enormously. Jake Gyllenhaal gives Searcher an energy that makes the character's contradictions believable. Searcher can be affectionate, awkward, enthusiastic, frustrated, and controlling without feeling like several unrelated characters stitched together. That matters because Searcher cannot work if we see him simply as a bad father. We have to understand why he believes he is doing better than Jaeger did. One of the most revealing stretches comes when Searcher watches Ethan connect with Jaeger. You can feel several emotions competing inside him. There is concern, there is irritation, there is old resentment, and underneath all of it, there is fear that the part of his father he rejected might somehow attract his own son. That is more complicated than ordinary jealousy. Searcher sees Jaeger becoming important to Ethan, and suddenly the past he thought he escaped is entering the future he thought he controlled. Gyllenhaal plays Searcher's anxious attempts to manage those situations with enough warmth that the character remains sympathetic even when his behavior becomes frustrating. Dennis Quaid gives Jaeger the opposite kind of presence. Jaeger enters scenes like someone accustomed to being the story. His confidence is so oversized that you immediately understand why living beside him would be exhausting. But the performance does not make him completely hollow. There is genuine affection underneath the bravado. That difference is important. Jaeger's problem is not the absence of love. His problem is that he spent years treating his definition of greatness as if it were universal. That makes the eventual family tension more believable because nobody needs to transform from villain into good person. They need to learn how to love without writing somebody else's life for them. Chabuki Young White's Ethan gives the film its necessary third rhythm. Ethan is not simply Searcher at a younger age. That would have weakened the entire generational idea. He is more comfortable with uncertainty. His instinct toward cooperation becomes especially important because the film repeatedly contrasts it with the adult's desire to identify an obstacle and overpower it. Through Ethan's strange world makes curiosity feel different from conquest. That is a subtle distinction, but it is central to everything the movie is trying to say. The visual direction is another major strength. The strange world itself is easily the film's most memorable filmmaking achievement. There are frames packed with movement, strange biological shapes, enormous spatial relationships, and creatures that seem impossible to categorize at first glance. But the best images are not simply colorful, they reinforce uncertainty. You look at the environment and constantly wonder what is landscape, what is creature, what is harmless, and what function any part of this place actually serves. That visual instability supports the story perfectly. Then there is the sound and music. Henry Jackman's score understands that the film needs two identities operating simultaneously. There is the broad adventure feeling the sense of expedition, movement, danger, and discovery. But the music also has to leave room for a more intimate family story. The resort helps the movie shift between spectacle and personal conflict without making every transition feel like we have entered an entirely different film. Sound design becomes especially valuable inside the strange world. Because so many organisms lack familiar real world equivalents, their movement and presence need to be communicated through sound as much as design. The environment clicks, pulses, moves, and reacts. That makes the place feel inhabited even when the characters cannot understand what inhabits it. And then there is the scene that for me represents the movie at its best. It is not one of the biggest action moments. It is the point where Searcher's relationship with Ethan finally exposes the generational pattern underneath his behavior. Searcher realizes that despite spending his life rejecting Jaeger's parenting, he has still begun placing his own expectations onto Ethan. That realization is the emotional center of the movie. Because Searcher does not discover that he has become exactly like his father. The film is smarter than that. He discovers that you can behave differently and still repeat the same mistake. Jaeger wanted Searcher to inherit adventure. Searcher wants Ethan to inherit the farm. The dream changes. The assumption remains. That idea is what I find genuinely memorable about Strange World. It understands that breaking a generational pattern requires more than choosing the opposite lifestyle. You have to identify the mechanism underneath the pattern. Otherwise, you simply rebuild the same cage using different materials. And the movie connects that beautifully to its environmental argument. Avalonia cannot solve its problem merely by finding another convenient resource and continuing exactly as before. The characters have to reconsider the relationship between comfort, consumption, and consequence. Satcher has to do the same emotionally. He cannot just offer Ethan a better future. He has to accept that Ethan gets to decide what better means. That connection between intimate family behavior and the larger ecosystem is the film's most impressive achievement. It gives the colorful adventure a reason to exist beyond spectacle. Not every emotional beat reaches the power of that central idea. But when the movie allows its visual world, character conflict, and theme to click together, you can see the stronger film hiding inside it. And unfortunately, recognizing that potential also makes the next compartment unavoidable. Because some of the exact qualities that make Strange World interesting also reveal why it never becomes as emotionally powerful as it could have been. The frustrating thing about Strange World is that most of its weaknesses are not caused by bad ideas. They come from good ideas that are not given enough dramatic pressure. The film has a strong central structure, three generations, three competing definitions of purpose, a society built around a resource it does not fully understand, an environment that challenges the assumption that everything unfamiliar is an enemy. That is a lot of potentially powerful material. But the movie often moves through those ideas faster than the emotion can settle. The first weakness is pacing. Strange World wants to be an adventure, a comedy, a family drama, an environmental story, a generational conflict, and a mystery at the same time. Because it keeps moving between those modes, important emotional moments sometimes feel like stops along the route rather than experiences the characters are forced to live inside. Searcher and Jaeger have decades of unresolved pain between them. That should be enormous. Jaeger disappeared while pursuing the mission that mattered more to him than returning home. Seacher built his whole adult identity partly in opposition to that choice. When they meet again, the movie has enough material for a painfully complicated relationship, but it rarely allows that tension to become truly uncomfortable. Their conflict is understandable almost immediately. Jaeger wanted adventure. Searcher wanted a different life. Searcher felt abandoned. Jaeger felt his son abandoned the mission. The emotional geometry is clear, maybe too clear. The movie often communicates what each person represents before it lets us discover those contradictions naturally. That makes the drama easy to follow, but less surprising. The same problem affects Secher and Ethan. Their relationship contains the film's best thematic idea. Secher has rejected his father's lifestyle, while unconsciously repeating his father's habit of deciding what his child should become. That is strong, but the film sometimes emphasizes the lesson so directly that the audience is allowed to arrive at the conclusion before Searcher does. Instead of the revelation slowly tightening around him, you can see the pattern forming from far away. That weakens the eventual recognition. A second problem is that several supporting characters do not receive enough dramatic space. Meridian is capable, funny, and often stabilizes a family dynamic, but the story rarely explores her relationship with the generational conflict as deeply as it could. She is inside the family, yet much of the central emotional structure still belongs to the three Clade men. That feels like a missed opportunity. Imagine how much richer the family argument could have been if Meridian had been given more room to challenge Searcher's assumptions, explain how she sees Ethan's independence, or reveal how Searcher's unresolved relationship with Jacob has shaped their home over the years. Callisto has a similar problem. She is important to the expedition and represents Avalonia's dependence on Pando, but she often functions more as part of the mission machinery than as a fully layered perspective on the crisis. The environmental reveal would carry even more weight if the people defending Pando represented more distinct emotional investments in the system. Then there is the humor. Comedy is subjective, but Strange World occasionally uses jokes at moments when tension would benefit from being allowed to breathe. The film seems nervous about staying emotionally uncomfortable for too long. A serious conversation begins. A joke arrives. A strange creature interrupts. The expedition moves again. That rhythm keeps the film accessible, but it also limits how deeply some scenes can cut. And this connects to the larger tonal problem. The movie's ideas are more mature than its dramatic treatment of them. It is talking about inherited expectations, environmental damage, economic dependency, parental projection, abandonment, and the difficulty of accepting that something beneficial may also be harmful. Those are complicated ideas, but the storytelling often resolves them with a simplicity that does not entirely match their weight. Even the visual world suffers slightly from abundance. The strange environment is imaginative, but there are so many creatures, shapes, colors, and moving elements that individual discoveries can blur together. The first few unfamiliar organisms feel genuinely strange. After enough new designs appear, strangeness itself becomes normal. That reduces some of the wonder. A more restrained reveal pattern might have made specific discoveries feel more important. And finally, the emotional stakes sometimes struggle against the scale of the visual stakes. Avalonia's future is threatened. An entire system of life is being reconsidered. Yet the moments that should make that threat feel devastating are not always given enough personal consequence before the story moves toward resolution. That is why my 6.3 out of 10 rating feels appropriate. The film is not failing because it lacks imagination, it is failing to fully capitalize on its imagination. There is a better version of Strange World already visible inside the movie we received, one with longer silences, messier disagreements, more complicated supporting characters, more uncertainty before the answers become obvious, and slightly more trust that the audience can connect the emotional clues without having every mechanism explained. Those changes would not require a different story. They would simply allow the story to breathe. And the easiest way to understand both what Strange World accomplishes and what it leaves behind is to place it beside other animated adventures trying to solve similar problems. That opens our next compartment. The easiest way to understand what Strange World is reaching for is to place it beside animated adventures that also use spectacular worlds to talk about families, responsibility, and the consequences of how people choose to live. The first comparison is Atlantis, The Lost Empire. Both films borrow heavily from old expedition fiction. Both send teams into environments that appear impossible. Both are fascinated by machinery, lost geography, unusual ecosystems, and the excitement of crossing into a place ordinary society barely understands. But Atlantis feels more committed to the adventure itself. Its mystery creates stronger forward momentum because discovering Atlantis remains the emotional and narrative center of the film. The characters' relationships develop inside that mission. Strange World reverses the priority. Its mysterious location ultimately matters because of what it reveals about the Clades. That gives Strange World a more explicitly generational focus. But it also means the expedition can sometimes feel like machinery carrying the family toward conversations the screenplay already knows they need to have. if what you love most here was the retro exploration energy, Atlantis is an obvious next stop. Then there is Encanto. Visually, these films could hardly be more different, but emotionally, they are much closer than they first appear. Both are about family inheritance. Both examine what one generation believes it is protecting. Both show younger family members struggling beneath expectations created by people who genuinely love them. And neither story needs a traditional evil villain to create conflict. The difference is precision. Encanto builds almost every major character around a distinct family role. Pressure takes different forms depending on who is carrying it. The miracle, the house, the family reputation, and each character's gift all become parts of the same emotional structure. That is where Encanto outperforms Strange World. The Clade conflict has a clear central pattern, but the supporting family relationships are thinner. Sergev, Jaeger, and Ethan dominate the thematic architecture so strongly that Meriden never receives the same depth. If the generational conflict was the part of Strange World that connected with you most, Encanto explores similar pressure with considerably more emotional detail. A third comparison is Moana. Again, the connection is inheritance. Moana grows up surrounded by people who have a clear idea of what responsibility looks like. She loves her family, but something beyond the life prepared for her keeps pulling at her. That sounds close to Ethan. Yet Moana finds a stronger balance between individual identity and responsibility to a community. Moana's desire to explore is not simply presented as freedom from older expectations. The story eventually reveals that exploration itself belongs to a forgotten part of her people's identity. That makes the resolution feel like rediscovery rather than simple rejection. Strange World makes a different argument. It is more suspicious of inherited definitions altogether. Jagger's dream does not need to become Selcher's dream. Seacher's farm does not need to become Ethan's dream. The healthier family is the one capable of staying connected even when its members choose different paths. That is one of the areas where Strange World genuinely distinguishes itself. And then we have Raya and the Last Dragon, another Don Hall directed Disney adventure. Both films build elaborate fantasy environments and connect large social problems with intimate questions of trust. But Raya is much more conflict driven. Its characters live inside political divisions under direct threat. The story creates friction through betrayal, distrust, and competing groups. Strange World is softer. Its biggest conflict comes from misinterpretation. Nobody wakes up wanting to destroy Avalonia. Nobody needs to become an obvious monster for the story to work. The danger grows because people misunderstand the system they depend upon. That idea is one of the film's most distinctive strengths. It is also part of why the movie can feel less urgent than Raya. A villain gives you resistance. A misunderstanding requires the story to generate tension in other ways. Strange World does not always manage that consistently. So what should you watch next? If the visual expedition was your favorite part, go to Atlantis, the Lost Empire. If you responded most strongly to the family pressure, Encanto develops that territory with greater emotional force. If you like the idea of a younger character questioning the future chosen for them, Moana offers a cleaner and more powerful version of that journey. And if Strange World did not work for you because the adventure lacked urgency, Raya and the Last Dragon gives you a more aggressive narrative engine while preserving some of the same Disney fascination with broken systems and people learning to see beyond inherited assumptions. But there is one thing Strange World does differently from all four. It connects a family's inability to let go with a civilization's inability to let go. A parent clings to the future imagined for a child. A society clings to the resource that built its comfort. In both cases, the question becomes the same. Can you surrender something that worked for you when you finally understand what it is costing the next generation? And that question becomes even more revealing when we stop looking only inside the movie and examine the cultural world into which Strange World actually arrived. When Strange World arrived on November 23, 2022, it entered theaters carrying the Walt Disney Animation name, a Thanksgiving release date, and the kind of visual scale normally associated with one of the studio's major event films. Disney positioned it as a theatrical adventure before moving it to Disney Plus exactly 1 month later, on December 23. But the cultural story surrounding the movie quickly became less about the adventure inside it and more about how quietly it seemed to pass through theaters. Its domestic opening reached about $12.2 million, and the film ultimately finished with roughly $38 million in North America and about $73.6 million worldwide. Those numbers are especially striking because this was not a small experimental animated production arriving from the edge of the industry. This was Disney animation during one of the most valuable theatrical periods of the year, and that poor theatrical performance changed the conversation around the film. Instead of people primarily debating its strange ecosystem, its generational themes, or Searcher's relationship with Ethan, Strange World became associated with the idea of a Disney animated release that simply failed to create urgency. That distinction is important. There are films audiences actively dislike, and there are films audiences barely feel compelled to investigate. Strange World often feels closer to the second category. Even the critical response reflects that strange middle ground. Rotten Tomatoes currently records a 72% critic score from 168 reviews and the 66% verified audience score. Its critical consensus praises the representation milestone while arguing that the storytelling itself feels overly familiar. And its audience summary similarly points toward beautiful presentation without placing the film among Disney's strongest work. That feels surprisingly close to my own 6.3 out of 10 reaction. The disagreement between critics and audiences was not enormous. That is revealing. This was not one of those cases where critics celebrated an ambitious experiment while ordinary moviegoers rejected it, or where audiences embraced something critics could not stand. Both groups largely landed somewhere around the same basic conclusion. There is quality here, there is craft here, there are sincere ideas here. But something is missing, and I think that missing element is urgency. Strange World contains a message about inherited expectations and ecological responsibility. But it I have inside a narrative whose emotional conflicts often feel understandable long before they become dramatically explosive. You can admire what it is saying without feeling overwhelmed by the way it says it. That may help explain why the film's strongest cultural talking points were sometimes outside the traditional adventure mechanics. Ethan Clade was presented openly as a gay teenager, with his attraction to another boy treated as an ordinary part of his character rather than a secret reveal or a tragedy. The film consequently became part of a broader conversation about LGBTQ representation in mainstream family animation. Rotten Tomatoes consensus specifically identified representation as one of the movie's notable milestones. But the important thing inside the film is how casually that aspect of Ethan exists. His central conflict is not about whether his family will accept his sexuality. His deeper problem is much more universal to the movie's structure. Will the adults around him accept the life he chooses? That makes the representation feel integrated into the character instead of becoming the only thing the character is allowed to represent. And yet, culturally, controversy around representation can easily become louder than discussion of the filmmaking itself. That creates an unfortunate situation where a movie with a genuinely interesting ecological and generational structure can become reduced in public conversation to arguments that do not fully describe what is actually on screen. Then came streaming. Disney's official materials promoted Strange World as streaming on Disney Plus beginning December 23, 2023, only a month after its theatrical debut. The film remains available there, giving it the kind of long-term accessibility that theatrical disappointment does not necessarily prevent. And streaming may actually be a more natural environment for this movie. Not because the visuals deserve a smaller screen, they absolutely benefit from scale, but because Strange World never developed the cultural momentum of a must-see theatrical event. On streaming, there is less pressure. Someone can discover it because the artwork looks interesting, because they like Disney animation, or because a family simply chooses it one evening. That creates the possibility of a second life based less on expectations and more on discovery. I would not claim that the film has undergone some enormous critical rehabilitation. The evidence does not support that. Its current reputation remains mixed positive rather than transformed into beloved classic status. Awards attention was similarly limited compared with Disney Animation's most celebrated releases. At the 2023 Annie Awards, Strange World received two nominations for storyboarding rather than becoming a major Best Feature contender. It also earned recognition from the Visual Effects Society in several categories connected to the film's animated environments, effects, and Splat. While Yaglari Union and the film itself received additional nominations from organizations including the Black Reel Awards and GLA Media Awards. If there is one area I think deserves even more attention, it is the environmental design. Whatever you think of the screenplay, the artist created a location that supports the movie's central revelation instead of existing merely as attractive scenery. Once you understand what that environment actually is, its colors, movement, scale, and biological shapes gain a second function. That is serious production design work. So does Strange World feel timeless? Not completely. It feels very connected to an era when major animation studios were trying to balance theatrical releases, rapid streaming availability, broader representation, environmental themes, and family stories designed to challenge older ideas of heroism. But the center family problem is less temporary. A father believing he has escaped his own upbringing, only to realize that he has recreated its emotional mechanism for his child, is not a 2022 issue. That survives the release context. And perhaps that is where the film has its best chance of lasting, not as one of Disney Animation's defining cultural landmarks, not as the disaster its box office reputation might suggest, but as an unusual, visually ambitious film that may continue being rediscovered by people who discover that underneath the strange creatures is a very familiar family problem. And whenever a movie leaves behind unanswered emotional space, audiences begin filling that space themselves. Which brings us to the theories. One Strange World reveals what the Strange World actually is. The movie leaves just enough unanswered space for interpretation. And the strongest theories are not really about secret villains or hidden sequels. They are about scale. One audience theory begins with the final image. Avalonia is revealed to exist on the back of an enormous turtle-like organism surrounded by ocean that led some fans to wonder whether this creature might effectively be the only major landmass or perhaps even the only creature of its kind on the planet. One documented fan discussion goes further, imagining an ocean world where this colossal being carries the entire known civilization across his back. It is a fascinating idea, but the film does not prove it. The final pullback confirms the enormous organism and the ocean around it. It does not establish that no other creatures, continents, civilizations, or similar organisms exist elsewhere. So this theory survives as possibility, not revelation. And that distinction is important. The ending is powerful precisely because it makes Avalonia look tiny. For most of the film, the Clades behave as if their civilization represents the whole meaningful world. Then the camera keeps pulling away. Their farms become small, their city becomes small, their mountains become small. Even the creature carrying them becomes something existing inside a larger planetary space. The visual message is not necessarily that nothing else exists. It is that the characters finally understand how incomplete their map has always been. Another interpretation surrounds Pando. Many people read the plant as a metaphor for fossil fuels or environmentally destructive resources, something enormously useful to civilization, deeply embedded in everyday life, and difficult to abandon even after its hidden cost becomes clear. Environmental readings of the film have repeatedly made that connection. While Gyllenhaal and Clade openly discussed the movie as an environmental story concerned with how human beings affect the world they inhabit, this interpretation holds up extremely well. But I would push it one step further. Pando is not only about energy, Pando represents any inherited system whose benefits become evidence against questioning it. Searcher discovered it. Avalonia prospered because of it. An entire society reorganized itself around it. So when evidence appears that Pando is causing catastrophic harm, giving it up does not simply mean replacing a power source. It means admitting that yesterday's solution became tomorrow's problem. And that directly mirrors the Clade family. Jaeger's definition of success works for Jaeger. Searcher rejects it and creates another. That second definition works for Searcher. Then Ethan arrives and forces him to understand that a good life cannot simply be inherited like equipment. The environmental metaphor and the family metaphor are operating through the same pattern. A third interpretation involves Ethan's game, Primal Outpost. Some viewers treated it initially as character flavor, a fictional game showing Ethan's interests, but it functions much more deliberately than that. The filmmakers actually developed rules for the game, and discussion of its design confirms that cooperation with the environment rather than simply destroying opponents is fundamental to its concept. That makes Primal Outpost almost the miniature version of the entire movie. The adults initially approach the strange world with the logic of a traditional adventure game: find threat, attack threat, save resource. Then Ethan understands another possibility. The goal does not have to be eliminating everything that appears hostile. Sometimes survival means understanding how the pieces coexist. That sounds like a small detail until you realize the ending depends on exactly that change in thinking. The creatures attacking Pando initially appear to be enemies. Once the characters understand that they are functioning as part of the giant organism's defense system, destroying them would mean attacking the very mechanism trying to keep their world alive. The filmmakers themselves explain the reveal in biological terms. Pando is the harmful presence, while the strange creatures are part of the organism's response to it. So the theory that Ethan understands the Finn's solution before the adults do is not really a theory at all. The evidence is sitting in front of us. He simply lacks the skill to apply it at first. And that might be the most revealing hidden pattern in Strange World. The youngest Clade is not smarter because use automatically makes him correct. He succeeds because he is less emotionally invested in proving that an existing map must remain true. Jaeger has his map, Searcher has his system, Avalonia has Pando, Ethan has questions. And once we put those details together, the deeper layer becomes visible. Because beneath the giant creature, the family conflict, and the environmental allegory, Strange World is really asking what happens when survival requires you to stop defending the answer that built your identity. Beneath everything we have opened so far, Strange World is really about the danger of confusing inheritance with destiny. The Clades inherit more than names, they inherit definitions. Jaeger carries a definition of greatness built around exploration. Searcher grows up underneath that enormous idea and decides he wants nothing to do with it. He chooses a farm, a family, and a life rooted in one place. From Searcher's perspective, that choice proves he escaped the pattern. But the movie's deeper argument is that rejecting someone else's answer does not automatically free you from the habit of needing an answer for the next person. Searcher changes the destination. He does not completely change the mechanism. He still looks at his son and imagines a future. He still believes the life that gave him meaning should also give Ethan meaning. And that is where Strange World becomes painfully human. Parents often want to give children what they themselves did not have: more security, more affection, more opportunity, more understanding. But sometimes the thing a parent needed most becomes the thing they assume their child must need too. Searcher needed freedom from Jaeger's dream, so he builds a different life. But Ethan's freedom may require freedom from Searcher's dream as well. That does not mean Searcher failed as a father. It means love cannot replace listening. You can care deeply about somebody and still misunderstand them. You can sacrifice for them and still place expectations on them. You can give them opportunities and still become disappointed when they choose something you did not prepare for. That is why the film does not need Jacob to be cruel. It does not need Searcher to become cruel either. The pattern is more interesting because everybody believes they are acting from love. Then the environmental story enlarges the same idea. Pando is inherited prosperity. Searcher discovers something extraordinary. Avalonia builds its future around it, and eventually that success becomes so normal that nobody seriously questions what lies underneath it. That is how systems become difficult to change, not because everyone using them is selfish, because the benefits are visible, the cost is distant. Pando lights homes. Pando powers machines. Pando supports farming. Pando becomes part of ordinary life. So when the truth emerges, Avalonia faces a terrifying emotional problem disguised as an energy problem. Can you accept that something good for you is damaging something larger? And can you give it up before you know exactly what will replace it? That is much harder than simply defeating a villain. A villain gives you permission to preserve everything else. The truth about Pando requires transformation. Sacha faces the same choice with Ethan. If Ethan were merely rebellious or mistaken, Surtur could correct him and return to the future he imagined. But Ethan is not a problem to solve. His independence requires Surtur to change. That is the deeper connection between the family and the organism carrying Avalonia. Both survive only when the older system stops treating continuation as the highest good. Sometimes survival requires interruption. Sometimes love requires letting go. Sometimes the responsible thing is not preserving what previous generations built. It is recognizing when the thing has reached its limit. Even the movie's visual obsession with maps fits this interpretation. A map is useful because it reduces complexity. It turns enormous territory into something readable. But every map is also incomplete. Jaeger treats his map as proof that there is something beyond the mountains worth reaching. Sichel builds another kind of map for his life. Farm, family, Pando. Ethan continuing the work. Ethan is the character most willing to live without that certainty. He does not need his whole future drawn in advance. That uncertainty can look irresponsible to an older generation, but the movie treats it as possibility. The youngest person in the family becomes the one most capable of understanding the strange world because he has the least need to force it into an existing category. That is what Splat symbolizes too. Splat does not fit the normal visual language of animal, plant, tool, or enemy. Understanding Splat requires realization before classification. Ethan succeeds because he allows curiosity to come before judgment, and that may be the most important lesson in the film. Curiosity is different from conquest. Jaeger explores because he wants to reach the unknown and make it known. Ethan approaches the unknown without immediately needing to dominate it. Those are two very different versions of exploration. One says, "What can I discover?" The other asks, "What am I missing?" That second question is quieter, but it changes everything. Even the enormous living world beneath Avalonia ultimately turns the story's sense of scale upside down. The characters believe they are traveling through a landscape. They eventually discover that they are inside something alive. Suddenly, mountains, valleys, creatures, and Pando all become parts of relationships rather than isolated objects. That is the film's deepest image. You think you are standing on something, then you discover you are living with it. You think a resource belongs to you. Then you discover your survival depends on the larger system that resource is damaging. You think your child belongs inside the future you created. Then you discover their life is connected to yours without belonging to you. Connection is not ownership. That sentence unlocks almost the entire movie. Jaeger has to learn it. Searcher has to learn it. Avalonia has to learn it. And perhaps that is why the movie's final environmental message and its family resolution feel inseparable. A healthy relationship cannot survive if one side exists only to serve the other. Not between parent and child, not between civilization and environment, not between civilization and environment, not between the present and the future. Every generation receives something. The question is whether it treats that inheritance as a command or as information, because the real responsibility of inheritance is not preserving everything exactly as it was. It is deciding what deserves to continue, what needs to change, and what must finally be released. And once you understand Strange World that way, its place inside Disney's larger history becomes much easier to judge. Talking about the legacy of Strange World requires a little restraint, because this is where it would be very easy to turn a modest historical footprint into something larger than the evidence supports. As of 2026, Strange World has not developed the kind of legacy attached to films like Frozen, Encanto, or even older Disney science fiction adventures such as Atlantis, The Lost Empire, and Treasure Planet. There is no major franchise. No sequel has turned the Clades into recurring Disney characters. And there is no strong documented case that later animated films have directly copied Strange World's storytelling approach. Its legacy is quieter than that. But quiet does not mean non existent. The clearest place where the movie left something distinctive is in the filmmaking challenge created by the strange world itself. Disney Animation described the production as the first at the studio to require the position of animated environment supervisor, with Ben Fisk overseeing the problem of making the landscape itself move and behave as part of the living system. That was not simply a fancy title attached to ordinary background animation. The environment needed to function almost like another character, reacting, flowing, and constantly undermining the boundary between creature and landscape. That gives Strange World a small but real technical place in Disney animation history. The film demanded that environments stop behaving like passive sets. And that connects directly to what we have been tracing from the beginning. You cannot easily separate the characters from the world because the world is part of the mechanism. Still, we should not jump from that achievement to claiming that every later animated living environment exists because of Strange World. There is no reliable evidence for that direct line of influence. Its larger historical importance may instead come from what happened around it. By 2025, discussions of Pixar's Earlier were already placing Strange World alongside films such as Atlantis, The Lost Empire, Treasure Planet, and Lightyear as examples of an uncomfortable pattern. Large American animation studios repeatedly creating ambitious science fiction worlds that struggle to become major theatrical events. That is an interesting place for Strange World to occupy, not as the film that changed science fiction animation, but as evidence of how difficult this particular kind of animation can be to sell. Fantasy musicals have an immediately recognizable Disney identity. Sequels arrive with characters people already know. Science fiction adventures asking families to learn a completely new world have a harder job. They need to sell the characters, the environment, the rules, and the emotional hook almost simultaneously. Strange World had visual imagination. What it lacked was the kind of emotional or cultural event feeling that turns unfamiliarity into urgency, and its reputation has not dramatically transformed since release. Rotten Tomatoes still places the film in broadly positive but hardly exceptional territory. While a 2025 ranking of Disney animation films continued to characterize it as a visually ambitious production whose concept was more daring than its execution, that feels important. Some box office disappointments eventually develop passionate cult reputations that completely rewrite their place in film history. That has not happened to Strange World on a comparable scale. At least not yet. Its reputation has mostly stabilized. People who defend it often point toward the imaginative ecosystem, the environmental message, Ethan's characterization, and the multi-generational family structure. People who remain unconvinced tend to return to the same weakness we identified earlier. The ideas are stronger than the dramatic force carrying them, and maybe that balance will ultimately define the film. Strange World matters because it represents a Disney willing to make an original science fiction adventure without relying on a fairy tale, an established franchise, or a conventional villain. It also demonstrates that originality alone cannot guarantee cultural impact. A movie can have a new world and still need a sharper emotional reason for people to enter it. But I would not close the historical box on this film completely. Movies change when generations change. A child discovering Strange World on streaming does not carry memories of its disappointing theatrical run. They simply encounter Tigger, Safter, Ethan, Splat, Pando, and this enormous living environment, and that is where reputations sometimes begin again. Maybe Strange World remains a minor Disney curiosity. Maybe its environmental design gains more appreciation with time. Maybe its family message connects more strongly with people who encounter it without the expectations surrounding a major Thanksgiving Disney release. We cannot manufacture that future legacy before it happens. What we can say is that the film already occupies an unusual compartment in Disney history, a technically ambitious original adventure, a commercially troubled science fiction experiment. A movie whose biggest idea is that survival sometimes depends on abandoning the system you were taught to protect. And now there is only one major compartment left before the verdict, because we have talked around the final truth long enough. It is time to follow every clue back through the strange world, reveal exactly how the ending works, and see whether the movie's biggest twist actually earns everything built around it. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now, go watch it, and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. The biggest reveal in Strange World is not simply that the expedition misunderstood Pando, it is that they misunderstood the world itself. For almost the entire movie, the characters believe they have descended beneath Avalonia into an enormous underground ecosystem. The strange creatures are interpreted as wildlife. The walls and pathways appear to be geography. Giant structures feel like mountains, forests, rivers, and caverns operating a familiar rules. But those categories are wrong. They are not merely traveling through a strange world. They are traveling through the body of a gigantic living organism. And suddenly, nearly every visual clue changes meaning. Those enormous passages are not ordinary geological formations. The moving environments are not simply strange terrain. The swarms of creatures are not random monsters populating an alien ecosystem. They are functioning as parts of a living system. That is why this reveal works better than it initially seems. The filmmakers have spent the entire movie teaching us that appearance and function are not the same thing. Something looks like a plant but behaves differently. Something appears threatening but may actually be protective. Something seems like landscape but is alive. The twist does not introduce a completely new rule. It reveals the rule that has been operating all along. And Pando is the crucial piece. Searcher discovered Pando when he was young and built his entire adult life around cultivating it. Avalonia then built much of its technological prosperity around the energy Pando provided. For Searcher, Pando became proof that refusing Jaeger was the right decision. That personal meaning makes the final truth especially painful. Pando is not saving Avalonia. Pando is harming the enormous organism carrying Avalonia. Its roots have spread deep into the creature and are effectively damaging its wider system. The strange creatures attacking Pando are therefore not invaders trying to destroy Avalonia's salvation. They are part of the organism's defense. That completely reverses the expedition's mission. The characters came to destroy whatever was killing Pando. Now they realize that saving Pando would mean continuing to damage the living beings supporting their entire world, and this is where the environmental metaphor becomes impossible to miss. Avalonia built prosperity around something useful without understanding its larger cost. The resource was beneficial enough that nobody had much reason to question it, until the consequences became impossible to ignore. That same pattern has already occurred inside the Clade family. Jaeger believed exploration was worth pursuing because it gave his life meaning. He assumed CHR should want the same thing. CHR rejected that dream and built meaning around Pando farming. Then he assumed Ethan should eventually want that. Each generation makes the same mistake in a different form. They take something meaningful to themselves and mistake that meaning for universal truth. The ending forces them to break the pattern. But first, Searcher and Ethan have to repair something between them. Searcher finally understands that his desire for Ethan to continue the farm is not as different from Jaeger's pressure as he believed. He has spent years defining himself as the father who would never repeat Jaeger's mistake, and that is exactly why the realization hurts. You do not have to resemble your parent to inherit one of their patterns. Searcher does not abandon Ethan in pursuit of exploration. He does almost the opposite. He stays, he participates, he cares. But underneath that better behavior, he still begins writing Ethan's future. Once Searcher recognizes that, the emotional conflict changes. He stops trying to convince Ethan that the farm is the correct path. He accepts that Ethan gets to choose. That is the moment Searcher finally does something more difficult than rebelling against Jaeger. He actually breaks the mechanism he inherited from him. Jaeger has his own realization. His obsession with crossing the mountains consumed decades of his life. Reaching the unexplored side had become so important that the mission survived even after the family connection did not. But when he finally reaches the destination he has spent his life chasing, the achievement cannot give those lost years back. The destination exists. The legend was possible. But the cost was real. that gives the film's treatment of exploration an important final twist. The movie is not arguing that curiosity is wrong. Ethan is curious. The entire film depends on discovery. The difference is whether exploration becomes more valuable than relationship. Jagger wants to conquer the unknown. Ethan wants to understand it. That difference becomes essential during the final attempt to save the giant organism. Instead of continuing to defend Pando, the group has to help destroy the invasive growth threatening the creature's heart. And here the movie brings its visual clues together. The strange creatures that once seemed dangerous become allies in the same larger process. Splat is no longer just a lovable companion from an unusual species. Splat becomes proof that communication with the unfamiliar was possible long before the adults understood what they were looking at. Ethan discovered that through curiosity. The adults arrive there through crisis. The climax, therefore, is not really about defeating a villain. It is about correcting a misunderstanding before the consequences become irreversible. That makes the action unusual for a Disney adventure. There is no evil mastermind waiting at the center. No antagonist needs to confess a secret plan. The threat comes from a system that people benefited from without understanding, and the heroes succeed only when they stop protecting it. Then comes the most important visual confirmation. The film pulls outward, farther and farther. The strange world gains an outline, and the truth becomes visible on a scale none of the characters could perceive from inside it. Avalonia exists on the back of an enormous turtle-like creature moving through a vast ocean. That shot completes the clue trail. At the beginning, Jagger looks at the mountains and believes the world beyond them is the great unknown, but the mountains themselves were never the true edge of the world. They were only a tiny feature on something incomprehensibly larger. The Clades thought they were explorers approaching the boundaries of existence. They had barely understood the ground beneath their feet. That final perspective makes their earlier certainty look almost absurd, but it does not humiliate them. It humbles them, and that difference matters. The ending then shows Avalonia adapting after Pando. The civilization cannot simply return to exactly the life it had before. It begins finding other ways to function. Seacher also adapts. He does not require Ethan to become the continuation of his own story. Ethan is allowed to move toward a future that belongs to him, and Jagger is no longer defined only by the destination that consumed his life. For me, this is where the ending earns much of the movie's ambition. I still wish the emotional conflicts had been allowed to become messier before reaching this point. Searcher's realization is thematically satisfying, but the path toward it is sometimes too clean. Yeager's decades of absence could support a much more complicated reconciliation than the film has time to explore. Yet the final connection is strong. The movie begins with a family trying to cross a mountain. It ends by revealing that their entire concept of the world was incomplete. The same thing happens emotionally. Searcher believes he escaped Yeager's mistake because he chose a different path. Only after traveling through an impossible living world does he understand that the real mistake was never exploration or farming. It was deciding that love gave you the right to choose somebody else's destination, and that is the hidden detail connecting almost everything. Pando, the expedition, Ethan's game, Splat, the living environment, Chicker's map, Secher's farm, they all test the same instinct. Do you force the unfamiliar into the system you already understand, or do you allow new information to change you? Strange World chooses the second answer. The box finally opens not because the characters reach the unknown, but because they become willing to admit how much they never knew. After opening every compartment of Strange World, my rating stays at 6.3 out of 10, and that score probably tells you exactly where I land. I do not think this is one of Disney Animation's great forgotten masterpieces, but I also do not think its theatrical reputation tells the whole story. There is too much imagination here to dismiss it. The strange world itself is beautifully conceived, its biological shapes, moving environments, unusual color choices, and gradual transformation from mysterious landscape into something completely different give the movie a visual identity that deserves more attention than it usually receives. More importantly, the central idea works. Three generations of the same family believe they are choosing completely different lives, yet each generation risks repeating the same emotional mistake. Jaiga assumes Searcher should inherit exploration. Searcher rejects that future and assumes Ethan should inherit farming. And Ethan becomes the person who finally forces the family to understand that love does not mean deciding somebody else's destination. That is a meaningful idea. It is also where the movie comes closest to becoming something genuinely special. The problem is that Strange World often understands its themes more deeply than it dramatizes them. Searcher and Jaeger should carry decades of emotional damage into every conversation. Searcher, realizing that he has repeated part of his father's pattern, should hurt more. Meridian should have more influence over the family argument. The ecological discovery should create a little more fear and uncertainty before everyone can move toward the solution. Instead, the film often identifies its emotional destination early and moves toward it efficiently. Efficient is not always powerful. And that is why the movie remains in that interesting middle zone for me. If you love colorful animated science fiction, unusual creature design, exploration stories, or films about complicated parent child relationships, I absolutely think Strange World is worth giving a chance. It is especially worth watching if you enjoy Disney films that step outside the princess, musical, or conventional villain formula. If you need an extremely intense adventure, a deeply layered family drama, or a mystery whose answers are difficult to predict, you may connect with it less. The movie simply does not push its conflicts hard enough to reach that level, and today this is a streaming film for me. The visual design can certainly justify a huge scream, but the theatrical moment has passed, and the movie fits surprisingly well as something you discover at home without the expectations that surrounded its original release. Would I personally buy it just to own it? Probably not. Would I watch it again one day specifically to study the environmental design and notice how much of the ending is quietly built into the world from the beginning? Absolutely. Because that is where Strange World leaves me. Not amazed by everything it accomplished, more fascinated by how close it sometimes comes to something stronger. There is a better movie hiding inside this movie, but the one we received still contains enough originality, craft, and emotional intelligence to make opening the box worthwhile. And perhaps the most appropriate final image is not Yoga reaching some legendary destination. It is that enormous camera pullback. The family has spent generations thinking about maps, boundaries, achievements, and the path their children should follow. Then the perspective changes. Their entire world becomes tiny. The things they thought were absolute become only one part of something much larger. Maybe that is the real lesson. Sometimes growing does not mean finding the answer. Sometimes it means becoming humble enough to redraw the map. Every film is a box, and we open this one together. And with that, our journey through Strange World comes to an end. If you stayed with me all the way from Jaeger's first obsession with the unexplored mountains to that final revelation about the world beneath Avalonia, thank you. These long breakdowns only work because there are people like you who want to look beyond the surface and ask why a movie makes the choices it makes. If you enjoyed opening this one with me, leave a like, subscribe to the Film Box, and join us for more deep movie breakdowns, hidden details, honest reviews, and endings that deserve another look. And I really want your opinion on this one. Do you think Strange World was genuinely underrated, or do you think the movie had great ideas that simply were not executed strongly enough? Put your answer in the comments and tell me what you would rate it out of 10, because sometimes the most interesting conversation begins after the box is already open. Thank you for watching. Thank you for spending this time with me. And until we open another film together, keep looking for the details hiding just outside the obvious frame. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.